weird way around. It's one of the sort of advents, one of the things that social media has done.
Lewis Goodall was at the BBC, Sky, LBC, leading Britain's conversation.
Indeed so, yes.
You're also an entrepreneur, is that right?
Well, I mean, in the sense that we, news agents, so on, is a sort of startup and all those sorts of things. So a journalistic entrepreneur, let's put it that way.
But how do you juggle all of that? I mean, do you ever switch?
Don't really.
Do you ever switch off?
Not really. My wife will tell you, no, not really. No. I mean, it's impossible to. I mean, look, at the moment, we've just literally had a change of prime minister, the sixth one in 10 years. So it's very, very hard. Every time you think you're kind of sort of just getting a sort of like there's going to be a little oasis of calm, there isn't. But that's the world that we live in, isn't it?
So the big story today?
Well, it's the Prime Minister's resignation. It's still
Starmer.
It's still Starmer. Also, what might replace Starmer or who might replace Starmer? Yeah.
That will be your big story for the next week?
Oh, I think for the next couple of weeks, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, even though we change Prime Ministers more often in Italy these days, it's still a relatively big story when the leader of the country changes.
Okay, well, let's talk more about that on the stage. Just tell me why you quit the BBC. Because a lot of people here look up to the BBC. I've had bosses who blindly follow the BBC.
I think there was my feeling was, which side do you want me to sit on?
Okay, if I could get your attention. Lewis Goodall is joining us now for a talk on his perspective on the challenges facing journalism. You've just heard from big tech and some of the technical challenges that we have. But there's also the challenges we have, as we were just talking about, from viewers who can be so extreme. They're sitting there behind a mask in many cases.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, it is true. I think that one of the things that has changed about contemporary journalism, the contemporary political media environment, is that there is a process of radicalization that's going on. And that is happening, I think, much more quickly than most journalists assume. And I don't think it's just happening on the right. I mean, something that I've noticed a lot in sort of recent years is the extent to which, certainly in Britain anyway, liberal kind of left, what we would have once called kind of quite centrist, normalish kind of opinion, you see it online as in a far more kind of radicalized state. I mean, particularly in the UK, where, we have, like a lot of Europe, got this sort of populist right kind of threat as it's perceived. This has had, in the years of Brexit and all of those sorts of things, it's had a deeply radicalizing effect, I think, on liberal opinion. And you start to hear kind of people who used to be far more kind of, as I say, sort of a bit mushy, centrist, kind of not that political in some ways. They will often start to use the same kind of language and the same kind of conceptual framing that we might have once seen on the radical right or the radical left. So let me give you an example of what I mean.
But is that forcing you to change your framing of stories and the way you present the stories?
No, I don't think so, because I think you've kind of got to resist that. But let me just give you an example of what I mean. So obviously, I mean, it's hardly a news event these days, but we're having a new prime minister in the UK, right? And we're sort of doing it more often in Italy now. And, one of the things about Keir Starmer, who is in many ways kind of, there's a really fascinating thing about Keir Starmer, which is that one of the odd things about him is that he's so loathed by so many people. Now, you might look at Keir Starmer and think, well, he's not the most inspiring person in the world, he's not the most interesting person in the world, but what is there to hate about him, right? I mean, he basically kind of, is just this quite mild-mannered, ordinary-ish kind of man who's achieved quite a lot in the law and gone into politics. But believe me, there is a huge part of the British public who despises him. Like, genuinely despise him, and they can't even articulate why. And then there is this kind of smallish, but nonetheless kind of, significant group of people who are his kind of natural supporters, who basically believe that he's a saint, like an actual saint, that a man who is that decent, that good, could never be committed to commit a mistake. And when I've been reporting in the last 24 hours on Starmer's departure, that second group of people who would once have been like the ordinary people in politics, the kind of people not especially extreme or the other, they start attacking you as a journalist in the same way that the radical left or the radical right might once have done. They're saying, you're out to destroy him. The media have been out to destroy him from the very beginning. This is all part of a massive conspiracy to destroy this ordinary, decent, good man. These are sort of like, you look at their profiles online, they're doctors, they're lawyers, they're people who would once not have been especially politically radicalized, but they have become so. And I think that kind of gradual kind of, the fringe determining kind of where our journalism sits and where politics sits is for me the sort of crucial element and component of our time in sort of covering stories now.
So when you're covering a story like Starmer, what are your sources? Where do you go first to get your information on any given day?
Well, I mean, it would be the traditional thing. I mean, I spent the first part of my career as as we say in the UK, a lobby journalist, i.e. working in Parliament. And I do the same thing that I've always done, which is, the people around him, Labour MPs, sort of people who know him well and so on. But even that, just to take it back to what I was just talking about, even that now, I've never quite calibrated how to get to the bottom of this, but even that sort of traditional way of doing political journalism, which is, my bread and butter, which is, you go to sources, the sources tell you stuff, you relay that to the public saying, source X has told me this, source Y has told me that, blah, blah. Even that is treated with great suspicion now, right? You still say things like that online, you say, we don't want to hear about your sources, name your sources, all of this sort of stuff. It's a really different it's a different mode and a different sort of transition that I think we've had to adopt, because those more traditional things that I think would have once impressed people and impressed audiences actually just sort of generate suspicion now.
But that conversation is still open. I mean, there are a lot of journalists here today who don't have that conversation, who don't have that access to politicians. Yes. People in Pakistan, China,
of course,
Russia. What would your advice be to them? You're someone who really talks out loud, who takes these politicians to task. You don't even let them get a word in sometimes.
Oh, thank you.
But it's a skill, because these guys are spouting garbage sometimes, and you've got to find a balance, because people don't like it on YouTube, for example, when you cut in all the time.
No.
They want to let people speak and listen to them, but when what they're saying is garbage, you're going to call them out, aren't you?
Well, look, it's as ever with so much of the rest of the media, right? The truth is that what's sort of come out at the bottom is the kind of middle ground. So what do I mean by that? Like, you're talking there about, in terms of not letting someone getting a word in. We know because we're basically in the content game now, right? This is also a transition that's happened to journalism. We're in, as much as a journalism game, we're in a journalistic content game. And I don't resile from that, because as I always say, journalism isn't a museum. We're not trying to create sort of artifacts that might be sort of lifted by a curator in years to come and maybe someone will see. Journalism has to be observed. It has to be seen. Otherwise, what's the point of it? It has to make a difference. And so therefore, you've got to get eyeballs, and in the attention deficit age that we're in, that's difficult. We all know that. And so in terms of political interviews, you're right. Those sorts of live political interviews, both the politician and the interviewer now, they know the game. We're all looking for the clip. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not necessarily always the most edifying experience, and very often, obviously the difference now is that politicians have an advantage that they never used to have, which is that we used to be the ones to be able to just either edit something or put something out or choose which bits we wanted to use. Now they have the ability to do that as well. So it's become sort of more of a game. And so that is less edifying. On the plus side, and I do think that very often we get a bit Eeyore-ish in the media sometimes, we're constantly sort of harking back to an age that was better. My day job these days is in podcasting and political podcasting. The conversations that you can have with politicians and the richness that you can have, because you have more time, because things can breathe. Audiences love that, and they resonate with that, and the politicians like it, and the interviewers like it. So although, yes, the kind of clip game and the content game is sometimes a little unseemly, and we all know that, it's also true to say that the avenues to have richer conversations and do richer journalism, I actually think now is one of the most exciting things about the media. I mean, at the very start of the year, I went to Minneapolis during the ICE raids and reported for the newsagents, my show, from there. We did a sort of hour and a bit sort of special on that, of like incredibly rich, granular audio and visual reporting. My old life at the BBC or Sky, we might have got 3 minutes. If we were very lucky, might have got 7 minutes. In a far less rich, far less contentful, impactful bit of journalism. So you have to work harder to get the attention. But my experience is that when you do get the attention, quite often the richness of the journalism you're providing is greater. So actually, I think a lot of the media environment today excites me a lot.
How, though, do reporters in a country where you don't have the access to politicians, what would your advice be to them? How do you give them courage without sending them too far, without them ending up in jail, without them worrying about their lives or livelihoods?
Well, look, I mean, I've always been fortunate to report from political democracies. But that's my, the US, UK, Europe. That's always been my thing. I've done reporting from countries which haven't been democracies, but not sort of worked there day to day. So I don't really think it's for me to give advice. All I would say is that the positive thing about the world that we're in now, sort of related to what I was just saying, obviously irrespective of the fact or cognizant of the fact that there will be reporting restrictions and difficulties in those countries, is there are so many more. It is harder now for states to control the narrative and control everything we've seen. Look, let's just look at what we've seen with the Iran war just now. They try and put the internet down. Didn't stop the world and didn't stop incredibly brave journalists. Look what happened in Gaza. Again, Israeli government doing everything they can to control the flow of information, unbelievably, extraordinarily, and something they still haven't had enough flack for, in my view, literally preventing journalists from the only war zones in modern history for journalism to literally be prevented, for there to be a prohibition on journalism. And yet, thanks to the extraordinarily brave efforts of Palestinian journalists in Gaza, the world still knew, at least to some extent, what was going on there, actually breaking through the fog of war. So again, and which would not have been possible without some of the technologies that we now enjoy. So again, this is kind of what I go back to. We have a tendency as journalists to be negative. That's one of the things that the public often don't like about us. But actually, there's much to be tiggerish and excited about. And actually, I think, personally speaking, I can't actually think of a better or worse time in a way to sort of like balance it out to be a journalist. But I would actually edge on the better side because it's more exciting than it would have been 20 years ago.
So when it comes to your sources, have they changed over the past 20 years?
Well, they constantly change because we keep having new prime ministers. So you have to kind of constantly adjust to it, unfortunately.
I mean when it comes to being on TV or being on social media.
Oh, well, I tell you this. This was another thing which I think makes this age to be a journalist incredibly rich. I mean, when I think back, for example, I mean, the truth is your sources change according to what the story is, right? And what job you're doing, inevitably. And, when I think back to, say, the COVID period, when I was at the BBC and I was doing a huge amount on kind of, the health service and public services and what was going on in local government, I mean, it was like, it was impossible to almost keep it all in your head, right? Because it was such a totalizing story that, it was affecting and afflicting every part of British public life, like it would have been here and everywhere else as well. And at that time, genuinely, my best sources weren't politicians or people working in government, because to be honest, they didn't have a clue what they were happening. There were people who were DMing me on then Twitter or Instagram or whatever it was every single day saying, Lewis, this is happening in this hospital, or Lewis, this is happening in these schools, or Lewis, this is happening in this local service. So, and again, I did so many stories about, things about which I just realistically could never have heard, or at least it would have taken me forever to hear. Someone would have had to write to me or whatever it was, by which time the story sort of went away. So actually, my favorite periods in journalism have been the periods when actually, as sort of slightly hackneyed and cliched and corny as it is to say, your sources are your viewers and your listeners and the people that you form a relationship with, which is also something I think edifying about this new era of journalism, which is that, and it can be a bad thing because they can very much tell you very quickly what they think when they don't like it. But we as journalists, I think, do have a more direct relationship with our viewers, listeners, readers, whatever it is, than we did in the past. And generally speaking, I think that's a positive thing.
What about AI? Has that changed the way? Do you use that to consume news as well as produce news?
I don't really use it that well. I mean, I probably am using it to consume news in ways about which I'm not even aware, right now, like the rest of us, which is probably the slightly sort of unsettling or worrying thing. I mean, I use it for research and thinking, and it does have to save a lot of time. But I mean, generally speaking, we're not sort of rolling out yet. Although we are rolling out, certainly in the podcast world, technologically speaking, all the time. And even in the last 6 months, I would say, in terms of editing and video editing and so on, I've been struck by how quick this is changing.
What about the pressure of revenue then when it comes to creating new formats, doing new things?
Well, this has been the big thing about sort of my transition from the sort of traditional broadcast world to the sort of podcast world and a new media world is that one of the things that's most striking about it, and I still have a toe in the old world because I do radio shows and stuff like that, but one of the things that's striking about it, and I think it's good and bad, certainly with podcasting, I don't know if, I'm sure some of you will have one, it's very, very democratic in the sense that the data that you get, you know exactly what people like, and you know exactly what people don't like. because you get the numbers straight away, and you have actually very rich data on where it is. Whereas, in my old world in television, you'd get the overnight numbers and stuff, but it was all a bit sort of, didn't feel very real. It was all whatever, and it was quite consistent. There was like five...
Looking into a black hole and not...
Yeah, it was like 5% down. Whereas you can see with, say, podcasts, the title. I mean, we used to have, on the News Agents, my main show, we used to have a thing, we used to call it Mount Rushmore. And it was this thing where we knew that if we put certain politicians in the title, you'd always get a 20% bump or something like that. And the politicians who were on Mount Rushmore would change over time. So, sometimes it would be, whoever the Prime Minister was, Nigel Farage in the UK, Liz Truss was a big one for 4 weeks. And honestly, now it's just basically Trump. He'd like that being on Mount Rushmore, of course. He'd enjoy that. But, that's and that's good because you kind of have a very direct sense from the audience of what they're like. Of course, it can be negative because you don't want to just constantly be beholden and doing the same sorts of things and just kind of giving the audience a kind of exactly what they want at all times. And, because they'll just sort of get bloated on it. But it's this change for sure.
But with getting this instant feedback,
yes,
is there more of a tendency to think twice about what you're going to say or even self-censor yourself?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. Because I think that, I think any good journalist, in a sense, I suppose, good journalists, whether it's 60 years ago or 70 years ago, where you might be getting pressure to sort of self-censor from political authorities or politics, which we still get today, and if it's today from the prospect of a kind of online backlash, it's still self-censorship, right? The phenomenon is the same. It's just coming from different sources. And I think that good journalists will stop that from happening or prevent themselves from succumbing to that temptation. Obviously, it's easier said than done, and God knows, sometimes I know, if you're thinking about sending this tweet or saying this thing, sometimes you're thinking, bloody hell, do I really need that today? I know exactly what this is going to do, so do I really need this? But generally speaking, the sort of thick skin that ought to come from being a robust journalist ought to prevent you from going down that track wheresoever the pressure comes, I think. And that's the idea anyway.
Yeah, you've never been worried about anything that could come back to haunt you?
Of course, constantly. Of course. It's a constant sort of like endless bloody like self-conversation, right? Sort of monologue. Of course. And the main thing, of course, that you're worried about, which wouldn't have been the case, there's always the internet. The problem is, we all know this, right? The internet never forgets. It never forgets. It's actually extraordinary the extent to which you can sort of say something, and somewhere, someone, some sad man in his bedroom, in Leicestershire in England or something, will be sat there and within 30 seconds have dragged up as Lewis in 2017, you tweeted that, and you're like, what did I? I cannot remember, honestly. And so the internet never forgets, and so you're conscious, of course, that if you make a big call or you say, I think this is going to happen, or I think this is the reason that it's happened, and it doesn't, there are you just make a mistake, basically, or it's not even a mistake, it's just a bad call, which we all make. We all make, particularly those of us who are involved in analyzing politics, which is a fractious, disputatious thing, that there will be bad actors who are absolutely determined to say, this proves that your legitimacy is gone, that you're wrong about everything. It's about the internet, right? No one can ever just have a moderately bad day. It's like, it's the worst day of your career ever, and you will never, ever recover. There are always going to be people like that, and I think all you can do is be cognizant of it and just realize that these people are actually weirdos, and in the main, no one really listens to them because they're just they're just very glorified equivalent of bots.
Just a couple more questions now that we've got people's attention. Is journalism becoming lightweight?
Is it becoming lightweight? I think, to go back to what I was saying before, I think what's hollowed out in journalism, like so much of the rest of the media generally, or culture, is the kind of middle ground. I actually think it's actually extraordinary now the extent to which you can get, mainly sometimes because of podcasting, YouTube, you can watch 3-hour or listen to 3-hour shows about unbelievably esoteric, there'll be a 30-piece or 30 episodes, series about Bismarck and about how he relates to modern German politics or whatever. There's that more esoteric, deep, rich content, which I love and I celebrate. And it's true to say, like I say, we have endless clip culture, kind of 30-second bits without much context. I think what is true, and I don't think we've really cracked this yet, is to try and resurrect really the sort of middle ground, which is neither the kind of 3-hour endless kind of episode on this very specific subject, or something which is much sort of lighter and slender. I think those sort of programs that I cut my teeth on when I was starting out, shows like Newsnight in the UK, which were, you know, in-depth, sophisticated, on for 40 minutes, but still had resources. I think that's the sort of space that's missing, to be honest. And I don't know that we have the answer yet.
How far would you go for a story?
How far would I go? Well, what are you asking me? Well, I think that any journalist, you know what it's like. People in here will know what it's like. If you can feel, if you can sort of feel the sort of blood gushing around your veins because you can just know that this story is gonna land. Because we all know there is nothing truly better. Most journalism, right, unfortunately, we have to accept this, 99% of journalism is coverage, right? We're coverage, and most of it sort of dies, it comes and it goes, and it can be excellent coverage. But to be honest, most people aren't going to remember it. You know, we've done 3.5 years of my new show, and I don't know how many episodes we've done, probably, I don't know, 600 or something. You know, probably about 550 of those I wouldn't be able to remember. You know, they merge. I can barely remember yesterday's. They sort of merge into one. But there'll always be the 1%, maybe it's a bit more than 1%, 5% of stuff that people really notice and really make a difference in some way, that really kind of lands and everyone's talking about it, and it alters something. Even if by a microfracture, it just shifts something slightly. We all know there's nothing more thrilling than that. So if there's a prospect of that happening, and we all know, we kind of sense it, we intuit it when it's there, then pretty far, yeah.
And one last word, how can we be braver journalists?
By ignoring the voice inside your head, which says, don't do it, just go for it.
Very good advice. Lewis Goodall, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
It's been a pleasure talking.
My pleasure. Thank you.